I remember when I watched the first season of Bridgerton. The intimate content was a bit much for me, and I didn't like those parts very much. However, the costume and set design was gorgeous. As I watched the series, I found myself enjoying the way the aristocracy of Georgian England dressed and spoke. I noticed that I sat up straighter when watching the show, but I also noticed that I felt strange watching the female characters in particular. I found it odd that these were teenage girls and young women who were expected to maintain marriages and bear a considerably large quantity of children, yet they were not properly educated about their bodies or what personal boundaries were. It seemed to me like the objective was to keep these girls and women ignorant so that they remained malleable, easy to control and take advantage of. The more I paid attention to this phenomenon, the more suspicion crept into my mind. I wanted to know what this marriage mart was, and what the values and standards for aristocratic people in Georgian society were like. I wanted to know why the girls and women were so unaware of basic marital realities like where babies come from. Was this really what life in Georgian England was like for girls and women, or was the show written this way for comedic effect? So today, we're going to talk about how Regency England viewed women, men, and marriage. Based on the book series written by Julia Quinn, Bridgerton is a television show about 8 siblings living during the Regency era in England. The series follows them as they attempt to find love and secure beneficial marriages for themselves. All this while grappling with the politics of living in an aristocratic community. England's Regency era spanned from 1811 to 1820, though it can be expanded to 1837 to coincide with the end of William IV's reign and the beginning of Queen Victoria's. The institution of religion had a huge role in the creation of marriages and families. The religious landscape of that time was primarily populated by the Anglican Church of England and evangelicals. Religious sects that sat lower on the totem pole included the Presbyterians, Baptists, Jews, Roman Catholics, and Quakers. To encourage and maintain high membership numbers, the Anglican Church provided incentives to people who joined the denomination and exclusion to those who didn't. For example, only Anglicans could attend Oxford University, and for the majority of the Regency era, all marriages and baptisms, excluding those of Jews and Quakers, had to be conducted at an Anglican church. The Anglican Church had a lot of power and influence over culture since it was controlled and sponsored by the government, meaning that all citizens, whether Anglican or not, had to pay taxes to maintain the Anglican Church's buildings. Not only that, but non-Anglicans were not allowed to take government office or military posts. There were various rules for courtship in Georgian England, and the rules and standards for women and men were not the same. Women received little to no education about their bodies. Her main job as a wife was to produce heirs for her husband. However, these women were not informed about how babies were even made, or how to even understand their reproductive health in general. They were also underprepared to comprehend the full extent of what men were physically interested in when interacting with them. This extensive innocence was considered very desirable by men and was seen as proof of their purity. In fact, to even speak to a man unchaperoned would destroy a woman's reputation. Women who did have intimate partners prior to marriage were looked at as being no different from escorts and were customarily used by young men to gain experience in preparation for marriage. On the other hand, men were not expected to adhere to the same standards of innocence. In fact, quite the contrary, they were expected to get as much experience as possible and would go on long travels throughout Europe, frequently going to local brothels in the various cities they visited. They would also have affairs with women who had been with men outside of wedlock and were no longer considered eligible for marriage. This gained experience was considered a vitally important part of ensuring that they knew how to make sure their wives produced heirs for them. A husband, being the only person in the relationship who knew how pregnancy occurred, ensured that the baby was conceived without protest, given the fact that the wife was oblivious to what was happening to her body. This philosophy of family planning left me stunned and a bit disgusted, to be honest. The fact that girls and women were expected to be able to produce children while being in such an unenlightened state of mind, lacking wisdom and purpose, told me that they were seen as livestock rather than human beings. They were treated as cattle who just so happened to be able to hold conversation. Now, this doesn't mean that there weren't people who had happy partnerships and healthy familial dynamics. I'm sure they existed too. But from what I'm seeing here, it seems like they would have existed as the exception and not as the rule. The actual agreement to the marriage was arranged between the two families, leaving the woman with little choice in the matter. Any financial assets she had would become her husband's when she got married. The rules around marital fidelity were also different for men and women. Society didn't see men being unfaithful to their wives as a bad thing, while unfaithful women were commonly casted out of the community and had access to their children revoked as punishment for her lack of proper character. To add insult to injury, divorce was very rarely an option for an unhappy couple. Women who didn't marry were known as spinsters. Because women were traditionally not allowed to receive a formal education, their ability to develop profitable skills with which to financially support themselves was very limited. Many spinsters were forced to live off the charity of their relatives. Their relatives would have them care for various family members who were suffering from illness as a way of earning their keep. Therefore, it was terribly important for women to marry men who had an impressive income that could provide for them the necessities that they were legally prohibited from being able to provide for themselves in order to avoid a fate like this. It was common for women to die in childbirth, and this common reality meant that women who were still considered eligible for marriage and had not gotten married as teenagers had the opportunity to get married to the widowers who needed women to maintain the house and raise their children. It was also common for widowers to marry widows for this reason as well. However, just because this was the prevailing belief at the time doesn't mean that everyone agreed with this ideology. And few Georgians voiced their disapproval of these ideas like Jane Austen did in her book Pride and Prejudice. Her criticism of these concepts and proposal of what they should be replaced with instead has influenced many generations regarding what marriage and family should be about. In his 2019 academic paper for the International Journal on Studies in English Language and Literature, Professor Tahira Badinjki wrote about Austen's criticisms of what she saw as a woman living in Georgian society. He wrote about how in Pride and Prejudice, Austen criticized the Georgian stereotype of family, marriage, and the roles that men and women were expected to play in both. She specifically focused on the existence of women in Georgian society as objects that were traded and not allotted social fairness. She posited that the best marriages and families prioritized fostering understanding, love, equality, and mutual respect, rather than ignorance, loathing, control, and dominance. It would seem that Austen herself had an inside knowledge of the Church's role in facilitating and maintaining the creation of marriages because her father, George Austen, was a cleric of the Church of England and a rector of Dean and Steventon in Hampshire, a ceremonial county in southeast England. Professor Badinjki wrote that women were expected to be genteel, submissive, and passive, that they could not inherit wealth, and were not allowed to financially support themselves. They were not allowed to pursue an education, as that would cause women to have a tool that made them independent from men, and their fates would no longer be under the control of the men around them, therefore possibly limiting the access men had to the production of heirs for themselves. Their role was limited to domestic duties. They were expected to sew, sing, dance, write, read, and play music. Austen portrays women's dependence on marriage for social security. Notions of womanhood in her works were derived from her culture and her contemporaries. All her women are portrayed as pious, pure, submissive, and dependent on men in their lives. The maximum goal for a woman was to marry a wealthy man in order to have a comfortable life because they did not have other options. In his paper, Badinsky presented how, through her writing, Austen explained what she believed a truly healthy and stable marriage looked like, with how she wrote the relationship between Elizabeth Bennet and her husband, Mr. Darcy. In The Marriage of Elizabeth and Darcy, Austen portrays an opposite picture of the established norms. She tries to convey the message that individuals should make decisions without taking into consideration society's construct and conventional attitudes. She criticizes the current practices and assumptions of marriage in her society without undermining the ideal of marriage itself. Learning about why the girls and women in Bridgerton were so unaware of their bodies and life in general made me so very grateful to live at a time when girls and women are able to have these discussions and have a say in what they want to be in life. Watching Bridgerton and learning about the philosophy that directed Georgian society's beliefs about men and women did not make me dislike the idea of marriage and family. It made me think about how important and powerful applied knowledge is if you're going to create a healthy family life. When one is allowed to take the initiative to learn about the world and human nature and actually apply the knowledge they gain, they can protect themselves from manipulation and have the power to choose what they want in their own lives. Your ability to form and articulate independent thought is developed when one gains and applies knowledge. And if we are going to ever succeed at creating and preparing the next generation to survive in this world, passing on these skills is vitally important. So, have you watched Bridgerton? And what do you think about Georgian England's customs of courtship? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.